Well, thank you so much, Anne. We're really happy to be here. And we were actually thinking that closing this day and summarizing some of the issues was going to be the challenge, but I believe it's actually following a very emotional moment of this day. And thank you for bringing all these ideas together. So, as was said, my name is Julia Staudt, this is Joshua Polchar, and we both come from the Strategic Foresight unit of the OECD, where we work to build anticipatory governance and capacity in our own organization and governments around the world. Now, this was a day fully devoted to the future of democracy and governance. I believe we've heard lots of interesting ideas and from many speakers from many walks of life. Now, Josh and I are going to reflect on some of those ideas that were discussed today and hopefully wrap it all up into something galvanizing that will help us push this conversation into the future. And we're very lucky to be joined in this endeavor by the Young Talent Network of ESPAS. So I want to welcome Isabella, Simon, Simonetta, and Julian to join us here on stage.
You want to sit in the middle?
Yeah.
You want to sit in the middle here?
Yeah.
You go then.
So, we've heard of a lot of challenges and problems that democracies are currently dealing with. We've heard of threats, internal and external, of lots of political risks and things that we all worry about. It really seems to me that none of us in this room is currently short of any work. Let's hear some of those ideas that were discussed and some of the issues we talked about today. So let me start with you, Isabella. What is one challenge that really stuck with you today?
Well, I think before going into the challenge, I want to say that we had at least two good news today. First one is that we're better than chimps. So this is something very important. And the second one is also that it seems that it's less and less likely to die in an airplane crash. So this is also another good news of the day. Challenges, well, we are so many. I think a concept that is going to stay with me is this concept of permanent crisis. It was said from different speakers that we are witnessing this constant crisis mode. It was also said that apparently governments are better in crisis management. So there already I see a contradiction somehow, because how can it be that we are in permanent crisis, governments are better in crisis management, and still we hear so much against the current situation of democracy? And just to wrap up this concept, well, I also think that if it's permanent, if it's always there, so maybe we should stop referring to it as a crisis. We should just assume that this is the new normal. And so this is the moment when citizens should not worry anymore about a new crisis, but we'll just say, okay, that's it, and we have to be more agile in addressing them.
Crisis mode, that was definitely something we heard a lot about today. Simon, what is one thing you want to share?
Yeah, thank you. We heard a lot of interesting contributions today, but what stuck with me is something that I maybe haven't heard enough, but that is to me a problem that is at least as big as the big elephant in one of the last slides of Andras and Ramland's presentation, and that's to me the capacity of our current institutions, be they economic, be they political, be they social, to respond to the enormous challenge of climate change. That is something that poses a fundamental challenge to our society, our way of living in our institutions, and I'm not sure where we're going and how we're going to respond to that.
Yeah, really important point. Thank you. So moving on to Simonetta. Oh, you have a microphone. All right. What is one challenge that you're still grappling with from today?
I think one that resonated in particular with me was something that Vice President Timmermans raised the very beginning of the day and was also touched upon a little bit by Aleph Scott earlier, and that's the role of civil society, and in particular the fact that women and young people are seemingly unaware of their ability to redress things. And Frans Timmermans suggested that the moment they actually begin to realize their potential to bring about change, we could see a real positive shift. Now, I think that prompts the inevitable question, at least in my mind, is if we assume that there is real untapped potential here to improve things, what are we actually doing to empower this category of people? Do we actually have a strategy to include these groups more? Are we tailoring our communication to appeal to them more? Do we have good examples from around the world that we could take on, for example, at European level, to integrate them? Can technology help, for example, in this aspect? Can cities, municipalities, we touched a little bit upon them, they're closer to the citizens. Can they engage young people and women more? I'm afraid I have more questions than answers, but I think definitely something that is worth reflecting on to encourage us to have a bit more of a modern and inclusive idea of democracy as well.
Yeah, thank you. And finally, Julian.
Thank you. The key challenge I want to refer to is about technology and innovation. This is a theme that's been going out through the whole of the day, especially in relation to information and data management. We heard a lot about the link between the governance and the citizens, and when answering to Anne Mettler's question, what is the first biggest threat to democracies today? John Podesta said that, well, he was inquiring whether technology would lead to an increase in freedom and empowerment or an increase in control. We need to ensure that our values and interests are not undermined by tech, and we don't want to end up with a truth score, as Alice Scott very powerfully brought up today. But I also want to highlight very briefly the other point made by our tech ambassador from Denmark, Ambassador Klinge, that the tech revolution brings new forms of inequality with winners and losers also on the job market. So a double challenge to do with technology on the political side and economic and social side to do with innovation in technology.
Okay. Well, thank you all for those insights. And what I'm taking away from a lot of these messages is that they're quite ominous. We've heard a lot about challenges and risks, preserving, defending our model and our ideals. And I've heard someone describe the mood in the room as one of anxiety. But it's worth remembering that democracy has faced challenges before, and these have helped it evolve. It took many centuries and violent civil wars to get to principles we all take for granted now, like one man, one vote. And I use the word man advisedly because it took even longer and much more struggle to get to one person, one vote. And it's not just in voting that we've seen change. The principles in the Magna Carta and the Déclaration des droits de l'homme were also responses to crises and challenging times and were groundbreaking when they came about. More recently, the Constitution of South Africa rose from the collapse of apartheid and was one of the most inclusive constitutions and is regarded as a breakthrough for its time by many today. And most interestingly about the South African example is that many of the people who worked on that constitution were involved in a strategic foresight exercise, the Montfleur scenarios. So for us, that brings about the question, can we get to the breakthrough? Can we get to the policy innovation without having to go through the paralysis of crisis? Democracy has constantly changed and reinvented itself over the centuries. And every time it does, it pulls our societies further forward. Now, when we were coming up with the concept behind this little session, we thought, could democracy do a Madonna? So it's not because our present problems are so big that we can't aspire to do more in the future. In fact, it's the opposite. So now is the time to start challenging our assumptions about what democracy can and should be, and to start thinking about how democracy can always aim higher and be ahead of its time. What if the civil rights movement back in the day, or the anti-apartheid campaigns, had had access to today's high-tech, social media, fast communication world? What if they'd been here today? So with that, I'm going to hand over to our colleagues and say no pressure. And we know this is going to be experimental, so they've asked me to put this caveat in. what are some of the bold experiments in democracy that you've heard today that we could start experimenting with, knowing that not every experiment works out successfully, that you'd like to share with our conference? Over to you.
Okay, no pressure. I like no pressure. But Commissioner Moedas said we can be bold. We don't have to be afraid of what we say, right? So let's be bold. During the day, I actually had a great PR idea for democracy. And it came through the Gapminder. So we saw how this website is helping everybody by putting to check like our toilet is all around the planet, to also enable people to be more educated about the different situation around the world. And while different speakers were talking, and if anything also the last speaker, of course, that was so moving, and it's the moment when you realize how much you're privileged. As Anne was saying, we're in this room, we keep discussing about democracy, and this is not something that would happen in every part of the planet, but it's education about democracy that is also missing. So why don't we do a Gapminder showing how different issues, how different kind of governance, of government are dealing with the same problem all around the planet. I think the people here in this continent, in many different other states, will be much more grateful also of what democracy is.
So a kind of Gapminder exchanging effective democratic practices, something like that.
Something like that.
Great.
Let's see if it works.
Okay, well, we're all in, it's not even beta stage here, this is alpha stage of development, okay? You're getting the first preview here on stage, okay? Let's go over to Simon. What have you
So my idea may be more of a better stage, because as we've heard from Mr. Zukowski and, for example, the experience with participatory budgeting at local level, the idea of Mr. Welle this morning to build a feedback loop between citizens and EU institutions directly. These are all experiments that are ongoing and that should be ongoing to further increase the flexibility of our political institutions to respond to changes and build experiences and try out, make experiments on what can work in bringing people into the process and testing out the policies that we implement. So I think this is a seed that should be put into the ground, should be fertilized and watered, and so that it can grow into something more, and so maybe a new structure of institutions, both at local level, at national level, and at European level.
Yeah, so participatory democracy and budgets. We heard earlier the idea that officials could monitor social media to learn how they can make public policy better. I suppose that kind of ties in. Maybe a question for the audience. Who has participated in one of these online participatory budgets? I know that the city of Paris does one. Who's interacted with their municipality online? Raise your hand. Okay, if you're not raising your hand, it takes two to tango. So maybe when you get out of this room, this is your chance. So let's hand over to this side of the sofa.
Thank you, Joshua. Mine are rather a bit more tongue-in-cheek suggestions, if you'll accept a slightly lighter note towards the end. We saw some of these long-term trends that clearly are of concern in particular to the younger generation. They're the ones that are ultimately going to be most affected by this. So do we want to consider, contrary to what you were saying, Joshua, of one person, one vote, do we want to consider those that are most affected by some of these trends have the right to perhaps adopt the principle of one person, two votes? Putting it out there. Perhaps young people in the UK might have been quite supportive of that principle a few years ago. And my second point is a little bit the importance, we spoke a bit about the importance of communication, how facts are simply unpersuasive. They don't condition us anymore. We respond far more to emotions, to feelings of trust. We discussed how some politicians were first showmen. Perhaps we should take a leaf out of that book as well, and maybe we should showbiz the EU a little bit more. I'm not suggesting commissioners should start presenting EU has talent, but let's try and add some attractive bling to the EU just to make it a bit more popular.
That's what we're doing, isn't it? That's why we're here.
I want to take you back to the topic of technology again. And because we have a consensus today between many speakers on what we might want to do inside the EU, so maybe that's not so experimental, about extra regulation, possibly increasing taxes. I want to propose an idea to do with using this challenge abroad in our foreign policies. We mentioned quite a few times Russia, China, ISIS, and of course Turkey in the context of control and disruption, and I'll get back to that. But I want to start with a positive note in terms of the use of technology. Next week we have elections in Armenia, and in May earlier this year we had a revolution, grassroots-led, to fight against corruption. That was the main theme, and it was led by a journalist, mainly via online media and social platforms. This is not new. Yes, we've had similar experiences in the Arab Spring, but in the post-Sovietic space, this is not usual. So elections next week, we will see whether this change will be confirmed or not. I'm not taking sides, as I'll be there myself also for election observation. For the EU, however, maybe we need to go beyond the defensive attitude we sometimes have to do with fake news, etc. We have a very good team working very hard in the External Action Service, Strategic Communications Division. Maybe we should also go further and promote our agenda. We're very good at talking about rule of law, democracy, fundamental freedoms, human rights, and in implementing this, we have strict criteria on fighting corruption. Maybe we should also have a criteria on fighting disruptive tech use. In trade relations, we are currently trying to set world standards on SPS, on geographical indicators. Maybe, just maybe, it's time now, before it's too late, to try to set standards in the tech world.
Well, thank you for those great ideas. I'm being told that the cocktail is ready for us. But we hope that these were only 4 ideas of many that we will be discussing after this little intervention that we planned today, because we want all of you to take a little bit of the Madonna spirit away with you. So we've heard today that aspirational thinkers in the past were able to come up with all kinds of groundbreaking innovations for democracy. And we believe that the future can be just as full of innovation, but only if we don't let today's challenges paralyze us, but use them to think big and to innovate. And actually, we wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for one really big, bold innovation. Somebody once invented the European Union. That wasn't something that was just laying on the table right there.
Okay. Very conscious of the time, Staudt. Okay, so we can do so much more than just solve our current problems and battle through the crisis that we're facing. And we won't get there straight away, and it's going to take experimentation. There's no silver bullet. So we invite you to take to social media, to your organizations, and to your dinner tables. We need to start asking the right questions and then experiment to find some effective solutions, and maybe some less effective solutions on the way as well. What are the deep assumptions about how democracy can and should work that we need to start challenging? And what new democratic experiments should we start experimenting with today? Tweet with the hashtag ESPAS18. I thank the Young Talent Network, Isabella, Simon, Simonetta, and Julian. And I'll hand over to Julia for a last word.
Actually, we want you to encourage to watch out for those ideas tomorrow at ESPAS Day 2 also.
Yes.
Enjoy the cocktail.
And we liberate you. Thank you.